Da-da-bum-bum. Okay, so for this stream, or at least this first entry into the night, I'm going to be basically looking at people's work online where they've asked for feedback. I'm going to read it, sort of make some notes, give my thoughts on it, and then I'll send them, send them my feedback a bit later. So the general purpose of this is just to, just see what works in stories and, just sort of see sort of amateur level type writing, which I usually include my writing among that level. And yeah, we're going to just go through it and see if there's any good stuff or what can be improved, and just my general thoughts. I come from less of a line proofreading kind of point of view and more just like story developmental editing. Okay, let's have a look. Maybe I'll turn this music down just a little bit. Okay, so this one is from 4chan, where someone asked for feedback. So let's have a look. See if you can see this okay. Okay. The first thing I saw as I gained my consciousness were the vacant eye sockets of a cracked skull, dark and oppressive. They stared at me as if I was being judged from beyond death. I stumbled to my feet, and to my horror, I realised I was surrounded by countless ossuaries that covered the walls of what was, without the shadow of a doubt, an ancient crypt. I felt like a trespasser, an intruder, who had dared to tread the unknown realm of the dead and was now about to receive his due punishment. I panicked as I felt like the darkness was about to consume me, and without thinking I fled towards the only possible way out I could find. Indeed, at the far end of the catacomb, I could see the steps of a stairway from whence a ray of amber sunlight radiated down, dimly illuminating the vault. So, just from this opening, I think so. My issue with this so far is that the author has skipped so many interesting details that would get the reader enveloped into this story and sort of engrossed in it. Let's see. So the first thing I saw as I gained my consciousness. So if we're just going by word choice and word trying to use as few words as possible for the maximum effect, basically. Let's see how they do. The first thing I saw as I gained my consciousness. Alright, so already there, in those words, I've got no emotional attachment, no intellectual attachment really, to what's going on. So, a lot of this can be cut down. Were the vacant eye sockets of a cracked skull. Oh, let me just put my Twitch overlay on, because I forgot to do that. Twitch overlay. Let me test it. Cool. So it says, as I gained my consciousness were the vacant eye sockets of a cracked skull. See, I like that's it. That's interesting imagery. A little bit generic, but it could be a lot more interesting. Dark and oppressive, doesn't really tell us much. They stared at me as if I were being judged from beyond death. Again, it doesn't really mean anything right now. Like, what does that matter if they stared? Like, it sounds okay, but it doesn't really have any kind of stronger meaning to it. One, because I'm not saying you have to like give a sense of character immediately, but this line is attempting to do a lot, and it's not really doing much of anything as a consequence, because it's really too vague. Like, you know, it could be something as simple as, I woke. The first thing I saw was again conscious. Because what you have basically in this first sentence is just imagery, but the author is kind of trying to make it more than it is. I stumbled to my feet. So like already there's a confusion of space and where the main character, the character is in the story. It's so vague. Like, I stumbled to my feet, which on its own has its own issues. You stumbled up to your feet, like, it doesn't really read and make sense. But it's like when you read these lines, you want there between the spaces of the words to have a really conjured up image of what's going on. And when you're beginning a story, this is, I stopped here because this is where you're either going to catch the reader's attention and tell them that you've got a really strong narrative voice, or you're not. And having read this, I would say that the author is not bad. I think that he or she is like on their way to getting a lot better, but they need to like figure out a means of being way more concise in their imagery and their intent. There's way too many vagaries so far. So I stumbled to my feet, but we don't, all other than the oppressive eye sockets area, we have no idea like what's really going on. And to my horror, so like the horror aspect can work, but it's like with everything else being so vague, it doesn't really land. I realised I was surrounded by countless ossuaries. I have no idea what an ossuaries is. Is a chest building to serve as the final resting place of human skeletal remains. Cool. See, that's good that you can say the word ossuaries because you know that word, but you do run the risk of alienating your reader by them not knowing. So you could say ossuaries, but at the same time you could say what you would see in an ossuary, which is all the skulls inside the ossuary. So that's just something there. It doesn't, obviously the word ossuaries, if you know it, is kind of like compelling, but in this context it's not. That covered the walls of what was, without the shadow of a doubt. Like, what does that do? What does without the shadow of a doubt mean here? Like, it doesn't add anything to the story, it doesn't add anything to the character, it's just filler words. An ancient crypt. Okay, it's an ancient crypt. What about the ancient crypt? Like, and I know he says, I felt like a trespasser, an intruder who dared. I felt like a trespasser. Okay, yeah, assuming you're already in a state of horror, of course you're going to feel like a trespasser. Or, I don't know, it's attempting to like try and make you understand where the protagonist is at, but you can't. Maybe you could do it in this concisely. The issue here is that it's both vague and too short at the same time. So there's a lot of filler words that aren't really doing anything, and so the information that we have doesn't really follow like a tight chronological timeline. So the thing that we have here, which is the important aspect, I think, is the first thing I saw as I gained my consciousness. I'm wondering if this person's first language is English, because it's not bad, but there's slight, or maybe they're trying for a more olden feel tone of writing, I guess. You know, a bit more H.P. Lovecraft or something. So like when a character gains consciousness, they do that slowly, and so when he says, the first thing I saw when I gained my consciousness were the vacant eye sockets of a cracked skull. Alright, that could be way more interestingly written. Because if your character's waking up and stirring to consciousness, then you need to like give a sense of what they were doing before, or if not that, then maybe how does their body feel as they're lying there? What's it like? What can they hear? Basically, one tip I would give is sometimes when you write, it's better to talk around what your point of focus is. You know, it's like that game that you get in shops sometimes where you get like a penny and it goes around. It circles around before it goes down the hole in the middle. And by doing that, by omitting the main central point of focus, which is the skull and the eye sockets, you engage the reader's attention because they're filling in the blank and they want to see naturally if their suspicion of what you're talking about is right. So if you're talking about this cracked skull with the vacant eye sockets, instead of saying that, talk around it. Say, something along the lines of, before me was a white face grinning at me, cracked, missing teeth, eye sockets, bottomless and penetrating. And yet as I stirred to consciousness, realising I was on my back prone and I had been there for a long time, what I'm saying is, like, and that's just off the top of my head, I'm just saying you haven't said it's a skull, but you're giving the feeling of the skull, and because like imagine like the grinning skull right in front of you, and that's the crucial part when I say imagine. You really need to like get the reader's attention, put their focus in there. So that's some of my criticisms there. Let's keep going. My feet ached on their own and I quickly crawled outside, emerging into the world of the living. Again, like, we have no context for who he is, what he looks like, how old he is, anything. Like, and that can be fine, but when you start saying emerging into the world of the living, it's like, what world is this? We have no idea of the world you're trying to create. And you haven't really given a sense of that. And although my eyes couldn't yet bear the direct sight of the golden sun, my laboured breath slowly became more regular as I regained my composure. Why had I ventured forth into that god-forsaken crypt? What had compelled me to put both my life and sanity at stake? This I did not know. In fact, now that my mind was for the most part at ease, I found I had no memory whatsoever that predated my awakening in the tomb. Once again I was gripped by terror as my mind struggled to remember anything of my past but failed to do so. My name, my face, my entire life, all had been taken away from me, like dust in a windstorm. This had to be the price I paid for desecrating the eternal rest of those who lay below me. In my mind came once again the image of that skull as its hollow pits devoured every aspect of myself, leaving me as empty and forgotten as that cranium. This was almost too much to endure, and my legs threatened to buckle under my own weight. So, it's an interesting idea. I'm not going to read any more because I feel like it's just going to make the same issues. I think the main issue that I have is that we're not really in the moment with the character. It's neither the H.P. Lovecraft style where we're being told a story, because when someone tells you a story, they in person, they make an effort to make sure that you get each bit of context in the right order, so you can properly see the story from their bias and their point of view. But we don't know who the reader's really talking to and why. I mean, the author, like the character, what they're trying to say, even though they're telling us what's the purpose behind it. Are we being told this story in the moment because it doesn't read that way? And if we're not being told it in the moment, from what perspective is the character telling us these things? Because ideally, I would like it if the character, or the author at the very least, said, okay, my character, in the chronological timeline of this story, at one certain point, let's say so all these events, whatever happens, at some point, could be weeks, days, hours later, they are telling someone what happened to them during that time. But because we have no sense of the time, everything just, and the purpose of why we're being told any of this, it all just comes across as very untethered to any kind of firm grounding to capture the reader's imagination. So that's my review of that. And here's another one. Antlord, Monsters in the Fog. Let me make a note of this one. How far in am I? 16 minutes. 1. Because I'm going to contact the people and send them a message, let them know that I've done this. Okay, so that one was finished at 16 minutes in. Now I'm going to do the next one. Antlord. Antlord, Monsters in the Fog. Horror sci-fi 62k ongoing web novel. I'll take any feedback you feel like giving, and thanks in advance. Okay, so this is chapter 1. Antlord, chapter 1. That was the first thing. Let me make sure. That was the first thing that popped into my head after regaining consciousness. Basically, see, there's a common theme there. Starting with the character gaining consciousness. Typically not a good idea. Though I've done it myself a lot, so I get it. The second, it is dark. That was the first thing that popped into my head after regaining consciousness. The second was that my movements were limited to a constrained space around my body, like a cocoon. The space I was trapped in seemed to be made out of a dry, paper-like material. I ripped through the paper cocoon easily, flooding my visage with light. I'm in a barn, I thought, confusion flooding my mind. This, ironically enough, more or less has the same flaws. It does it fairly, a bit more competently, but it has the same the word quality over quantity is there. It's more concise. The simplistic nature of it works a lot better because at least here it's not being too vague. I could basically skim read this, get the information I need from the story and keep going without feeling like I've been bogged down with passages like without a shadow of a doubt, and just where have I my entire life. This had to be the price I paid for desecrating the eternal rest of who now laid below me. Like, it doesn't have any of that kind of stuff happening too soon. So this works a lot better because at least it is dark. Okay, cool. We're given a hint of something to hold on to as the basis. You can almost think of this as like the really tiny Act 1. This is dark. Act 2, the explanation, Fractally, I mean. I'm in a barn. I think, for me, the issue with this one, though, is that the first thing... I'll read it again. That was the first thing that popped into my head after regaining consciousness. Okay, so other than regaining consciousness, this is mostly filler. Don't need it. The second was that my mood, but it does read well that he adds the second, plays into the first sentence, so that's quite nice. The second was my movements were limited to a constrained space around my body like a cocoon. The space I was trapped in seemed to be made out of a dry paper-like material. Now this, if it were me, I would go into a lot more detail about this. That should be 3 paragraphs, in my opinion. If you're constrained, if you wake up constrained, tied up in a dry paper-like material like a cocoon, that's fucking terrifying. And there's loads of things that you would feel immediately. You know, the constricted nature. Where are you constricted? Hands, legs, feet. How much can you move? You know, can you move? Are you really constricted? Can you not move at all? Or can you wiggle about a little bit? Like, the character logically would go through that process of discovering how constricted they are, but the author here, he's already skipped over all of that. You know, oh, I'm constricted, and then the next, basically says he's constricted, and then the next thing you know, I rip through the paper cocoon easily, flooding my visage with light. Like, oh, okay, so all that immediate interesting opening that you have where your character is in a tough situation, you basically say, oh, and he got out. It's just a bit underwhelming when you're trying to grab the reader's attention in the story right away in an interesting manner. I'm in a barn, I thought. Confusion flooding my mind. This is just not good writing, in my opinion, this kind of thing. I'm in a barn? Because if you just said, what was it? Flooding my visage with light. Who talks like that? I mean, this character, I hope he's not like some 18-year-old. Or at least he has to have some kind of eccentricity to talk like that. Flooding my visage with light. Anyway, I'm in a barn, I thought, confusion flooding my mind. The last thing I remembered... Testing? Okay, just making sure I'm still recording. The last thing I remembered was that spider fellow begging me to accompany it somewhere, though the spider was nowhere to be seen now. Cool. Before that spider brought me here, I was almost dead. I suppose I should at least thank it for saving me before I go out there and getting myself killed again. It was almost amusing being saved by someone who was on the same team as the guys who stabbed me, or maybe that was my bad sense of humour. Shaking my thoughts out of my head, I took a look behind me, where I burst out of my paper prison only to find rows and rows of cocoons stuck to the back wall of the barn. There are dozens of them, I thought, grimacing. My expression turned dark when I remembered what that spider said about the survival rate of the change. Only about 2 to 3% of people manage to live through the process. I paused for a moment and listened closely, searching for anyone still drawing breath, but nothing. They were all dead. I didn't know where they were, but I said a silent prayer that their souls would find peace in the afterlife. Perhaps I should have been more upset, but compared to everything I've seen up to now, this was only slightly shocking. I can't just leave them here like this. No, these people, at the very least, deserve the proper burial. With my mind made up on that matter, I reached out towards the cocoon directly to the right of mine, only to stop short as soon as my arm entered the field of my vision. Whereas before my arm was a rather pale shade of Caucasian white, now it was somewhere between deep blue and pitch black. Even more peculiarly was that the skin glistened in the half light. I winced at that, but nothing looking at the wall of corpses in front of me, I knew I should just be thankful to be alive. Besides, the skin around the wound I received earlier had already been turning this colour, so I wasn't that surprised about the change to the rest of my body. What did surprise me though was how shiny my skin had become. The sheen it gave off was like metal. Disregarding that for the moment, I ripped the cocoon next to mine apart. The person inside slumped face down to the floor. I could see the traces of bluish black skin where their flesh was exposed though, as well as something alarming. Although this person's back was hard segmented plates like armour, extended from the top of their spinal cord to the bottom of their posterior. Confused, I tried finding the place where the armour was Attached, I need to uncover a spot where the hard plates fused with her softer skin. Suddenly, I had a terrible premonition. That's not armor. It's a carapace, like a crab or an insect. So I think that's about as much as I want to read. So it's not bad. I actually think it's kind of an interesting story. That's what kept me reading for a bit, because I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. Like, the bit that got my attention was basically the implication that some spider guy cocooned him on purpose and that the character agreed to it. The fact that the character might seemingly have agreed to being cocooned was really interesting to me, because it's like, I don't know, it reminds me of like the Darren Shan books or something. Like the Cirque du Freak, you know, but where guy becomes a vampire, a kid chooses to become a vampire. So it's interesting. The body horror of this is kind of interesting. I just think in general it's very underwritten, you know, like if we use something like, I don't know, H.P. Lovecraft as like an example, or say Stephen King, they would go into way more detail with all this. And I'm not sure if this is the best place to begin this kind of story, because the character is already becoming, maybe it will go into like a different, yeah, cool. So the character's already, so that was like the sting opening, and then it goes into the character's day-to-day kind of thing before all this happened. So it's kind of interesting, but I think the main issue is the quality of the writing. It wouldn't keep my attention, but I think the author here has a decent sense of you know, what could engage the reader. Just there's a lot of potential here, so it's really cool. I think I just think this just needs to be better written in general. Like, let's see if I can try and explain the key reason why I think that. It's just that for me, the level of detail for this kind of story, where you're talking about a character experiencing like changes to their physical body, like becoming a monster, and waking up in like a cocoon and all that. Like, for me personally as a reader, if I don't feel like you're gonna really dig into those moments and really tap in psychologically to the fear and the experience of that, like if I really don't feel like you're gonna make those moments visceral and worth my time, then it doesn't really matter how interesting the events of your story are, because it all feels like the back of a cereal box, where it's all like written simply and to the point, and you know, it's just, you just really can't get into the story. It's more like reading a script in that sense. So yeah, that's my opinion on this. But yeah, it's pretty cool. I think if you're looking for like a light read, you know, and you're not trying to get into like a really in-depth story, this could be good. I think basically if you're into like insect body horror, like if it was like your really specific thing that you like, then I think you could probably get into this. But as a general horror, I think I wasn't. I think it needs a lot of work. I think the writer could spend a lot more time expanding moments and making them have more gravity and weight to them. And I think one of the kings of doing that is H.P. Lovecraft. Okay, so that's my thoughts on that one. That one's 30 minutes in. Go to the next one. The Case of Joshua Stimpson. Stalking turns deadly. True crime. Not really a fan of true crime. Not going to do erotic fiction. I am really bored and would love to know what strangers think of my writing. Start a chat with me with you want to exchange now. My debut novel, Seasons After Fall, is on sale for 1.99. Is available on Kindle. Okay, they're selling their stuff. The Sky is Falling. Existential horror. Description: a writer documenting her relationship with the ending of the world. Cool. That sounds my cup of tea. Let's give that a try. Okay, you guys can see that. The Sky is Falling. The sky is falling. It has been for the past 3 years, like the cracking of a beautiful fresco. Stardust and broken clouds hang above us, and long, horrific cracks, threatening to collapse once again. The chasm left behind is like nothing anyone has ever seen, darker than space, emptier than one can imagine. It's less than nothing, and it strains the eyes to see it. It's visible even at night, and not just by the absence of stars. One can see even its outline. The sky is falling. I hate the way everyone says it. The sky is falling, they exclaimed, followed by months of riots and proclamations of the end of days. But it's a lie. The sky has fallen past. It hasn't happened again since, and I doubt it ever will. There is no scientific explanation, no laboratory or university that can fathom to hold its unbearable weight. It screams an unshakable scream. Everything you know is wrong. Expeditions have been made. My brother, expeditions have been made, and we did not call them astronauts or cosmonauts, for they were not venturing into space, but something horrifically different. We called them Argonauts. We should have called them fools. Okay, so this is like a big mixed bag. So far, first thing is, good lord, stop saying the sky's falling. I get it. That's like the thing. I get it, but you don't need to say it that many times, because it kind of. Let's have a look. The sky's falling. The sky's falling. The sky's falling. The sky's falling. It's a bit much. It's okay to use it repetitively, but you need to space it out just a bit. Like what's a fresco? Fresco is a technique of mural painting. Again, another one of those things where like they use a nice word that has a good implication. But conjure up the image of a fresco of what you mean. It's like the cracking of a beautiful fresco, stardust and broken clouds hang above us. Like, it sounds good. It sounds interesting in that. But the problem is that the reader isn't centered into a point of view. Yes, you can say the character that's writing and telling this story is the point of view, but you kind of need to take another step back. So imagine, if you will, a woman. I imagine this is a woman reading this. I think so. I don't know why. I just imagine like this is a woman's story. Sophie, there we are. That's why. So like, imagine a woman's like standing on top of a building, and she's looking up at the sky, and we get this description. The cracking of beautiful frescoes, stardust and broken clouds hang above us, and long horrific cracks threatening to collapse once again. So the problem here is that we don't have the woman on standing on top of the building looking up, because by having that woman there, that we would have a vantage point from which to get this experience. But all we're really getting is, like, if you imagine someone stood at a shore, and like the roaring waves of the ocean, and a storm is there, and it's really like, fierce, and it looks like a really tumultuous ocean. if you take the ocean and there's no people, it's interesting imagery, and it's evocative, but it's not really going to grab you any more than that because there's no story to it. But if you get a character standing at the shore who's in danger of being engulfed by the storm, at least you have an initial vantage point with which to worry for someone, and it just grabs your attention more. So I think that's part of the issue of this opening so far. And then you've got this issue. There is no so she goes on, there is no scientific explanation, no laboratory or university that can fathom to hold its unbearable weight. Okay, you're telling me that, but can you not tell me in a more interesting way? For instance, if it was like H.P. Lovecraft, he would delve into, like, you know, he would have a bunch of scientists in the moment not usually in the moment, but he would at least try and give an explanation of scientific materials and equipment that they've used to get these readings and documents and notes. Something in the world and the story to refer to, you know, news coverage, that kind of thing. And it's not just enough to reference it, as in, you know, the news said this, but, you know, really create a tangible sense of world for the reader to start gaining their own point of view on. Because readers like to be objective, they like to sort of be impressed, but they also like to reserve their own sense of identity when reading a story. So if you had a half a paragraph of a newspaper entry that described the initial phenomena and the way a newspaper would describe it, at least you're getting a sense of the world, the tone of the world that's being created and the point of view. But when you say there is no scientific explanation, no laboratory or university that can fathom to hold its unbearable weight, it screams an unshakable scream. It's like, okay, this is fine, but it really doesn't it has no emotional effect on me, because where do I come into it as the reader? You know, it's like, why should I give a shit? Everything you know is wrong. Expeditions have been made, my brother. Expeditions have been made, and we did not call them astronauts or cosmonauts, for they were not venturing into space, but something horrific. I don't know. It's just vague. We're not really situated in the moment into an interesting point of view. Like one example you could have is having a reader, and you could have this same character, you know, have her sat at her desk. I guess this is kind of what the story might be missing, is like the characters writing these notes, right? But then we need to go one step back, vantage point wise, and see, you know, why is the character writing this? Why are they telling us this story? How do they feel as they're writing this story? So you can have the present moment of them writing what we're reading, then you can have what we're reading, and then that'll give, so that's 2 vantage points right there. Then the third vantage point is obviously when this is done, and the present is no longer the present, and we're moving, and the story starts to progress. We're moving forward, and there's a sense of progression. Right now, there's no sense of progression. We're learning things, but it's not tied into an interesting chronological perspective. You know, by telling me about Argonauts and that, it's like, that's interesting, but, you know, it just kind of feels like I'm reading the back cover of a book promising an interesting story, rather than me being in the book and really getting enveloped into the narrative. So the sky's falling and my brother fell into it. So when you have a line like that, it's like, cool, I'd much rather read that story. Give me in the moment, as the, you know, what is it like to fall into the sky that's fallen? Like, that sounds way more interesting. I'd read a short story about just, you know, a guy's final moments before he falls into the sky. That sounds really interesting to me. You know, but this isn't interesting. This is literally like a blurb on the back cover of a book, basically. But it's well written enough that it's I've kept reading basically, so it's not bad. I just think the author needs to make sure that the story always is centered. Like, you need to know what your character's doing in the moment. You need to make sure you're guiding the reader along in the story in the right way. And all of that, the only real way you can learn is by practice. The sky is falling and my brother fell into it, and the emotions are all too hard to explain. Something like melancholy, an eternal feeling of being on the precipice. Like, okay, cool, but it's like, I don't give a fuck. I don't care about this character yet. You've given me nothing of, like, okay, her brother's dead, fair enough. And that sets up an interesting precedent of, we know this story is about people dying and the existential threat and horror of that. I get that. But it's like an eternal feeling of being on the precipice. You haven't earned the right to start talking like we're in the story yet. If that makes sense. You haven't, we're still on page 1, not even halfway through the page, and this kind of talk, we don't have the emotional care for the character to even. It's like a random person on the street walking up to you and being like, an eternal feeling of being on the precipice. It's like, alright, cool, what's that got to do with me? Okay, my footing hasn't been certain since the day it fell, but I don't feel anxious. So this all could work. It all could work. My advice would be, add in the character writing this in the moment. So, she's sat at her desk, let's say, she's on her laptop and she's typing this up. And she pauses and she thinks to herself, how is she feeling? And she keeps some feelings to herself, and then she puts an interpretation of, like, maybe she omits some of her personal feelings and only puts down more like a less emotional version of how she's feeling onto the page. And then what that's interesting is that it gives the reader something to judge and to contrast, and it basically engages the reader's attention and imagination. Hurts, aches, that's better. Yeah, I'm done. So that's where I'd have to stop. I don't like this at all. This hurts things was like the last straw for me with this story. But it's got some interesting stuff for it. So there's definitely a lot of potential there. How far in am I? 43 minutes. The sky is falling. Cool. But you can see how a lot of these stories have the same issues, basically. The scribble, horror-ish. I feel like I got impatient and this just devolved into silliness. Please give me feedback, lol. No, I think if you're gonna ask for feedback, don't tell me that. Because when you say like, oh, it devolves into silliness, alright, that's your opinion. Fine, then I'm not gonna read it. Work on that. You already know what to work on. I had a reaction. It's political. I'm not going to read anything political. Short ship, short story. A sword fight on a ship. Fuck it. Cool. Let's read that. Okay, it's very short. Adan. Okay. Adan was jolted awake from a book hitting his head. He opened his eyes to the scrawny woman. This is getting kind of funny. Everyone's fucking losing consciousness and coming to consciousness. It's getting a bit ridiculous. Can people just be awake? Oh, that reminds me. I'm not sure if I put my just chatting thing on Twitch. Let me change that. Giving writers feedback for their short story. Okay, so where was I? Adan was jolted awake from a book hitting his head. He opened. See, like, this is what I just don't get. If you know your character had a book getting hit in their head, wouldn't you describe that in better detail? Because it's right there. How heavy was the book? You know, what part of the book hit the head? If it was the corner, it hurt a lot more than the spine. You know, how. In that moment, what did it sound like as it hit the floor? Like, just give me a bit more. He opened his eyes to the scrawny woman in front of him. Her beige skin and long black hair, wet from the salt-stained water of the sea. Her were eyes sunken back into her skull, her face scolding at him. Now I'm done. Just no. That needs too much work. I can't bother. Okay, next one. The Reluctant King, young adult fantasy. Approximately 20,000 words, yeah, more than is recommended. Type of feedback. It is good enough that you would keep reading once I have managed my info dumps effectively. Here are the first 8 chapters. Cool. The Reluctant King. Let's give it a try. Let's give it a try. Prologue. Sia was covered in blood and trying not to make noise. It wasn't her blood. Her guards had pledged their lives to her, and they had kept their pledge. Now Sia was hiding part way up the rock face and folded, wrapping the world around her to hide her. She watched as the soldiers with Kutar searched for survivors in the grotto below her. Kuto yelled at them, "Find him or her, whatever. Damn it." One of the men came out of the trees surrounding the grotto. He was short, barely coming up to Koto's chest, and had 3 red stripes sewn into the shoulders of his vest. He stood before Koto, staring him down despite looking up. Where are we? Her guards... So she's hiding somewhere. In the grotto. What is a grotto? A grotto is a natural or artificial cave used by human. Okay. So it's not badly written here, but I think it's actually quite nicely written so far. I think what it's missing is a sense of visual space, because you really need to get that in for the reader like as soon as possible, before moving on to other details. I also think this line, "Find him or her, whatever, damn it," that, if you're going to include that in the opening passage, then I would assume the gender or sex or whatever of the character is going to be like a thematic point of interest throughout the story. If not, I don't think this is necessarily worth keeping it in. Like, you could say Katal yelled at them to find her or him, you know, like why make it ambiguous as to what their gender is? So I'm assuming is part of the theme. Stop had 3 stripes. One of the men came out of the tree surrounding the grotto. He was short, barely coming up to Koto's chest, and had 3 stripes sewn into the shoulders of his vest. He stood before Koto, staring him down despite looking up. Stop with the yammering. We've been at it for hours. There's Nara traveller here, and none of the men or women are marked. Kuta sighed and looked at a dead woman near his feet, her red blood draining into the water of the grotto. Kuta sighed and looked at a dead woman near his feet, her red blood draining into the water of the grotto. He turned away, his back to 3 stripes and the slaughter. It was getting... So, I'm going to stop here. Actually, I'll keep going because I can tell the writers put a lot of effort in here. So I'll keep going for their sake. It was getting dark because I'd feel really cheaped out if I was someone else was critiquing it and they stopped early. I'll give my impression so far. There's a lot of nicely written stuff here. Very nicely, concisely done. I think the name Qatar is used too much. I think this doesn't really flow together. It's not badly written, but what it lacks is, if we're getting thrown into the moment of this story, then I feel like we need to be brought into something even smaller. So Sia was covered in blood and trying not to make noise. It wasn't her blood. Her guards had pledged their lives to her and they had kept their pledge. Now Sia was hiding part way up the rock face and folded, wrapping the world around her to hide her. She watched as the soldiers with katars searched for survivors in the grotto below her. Right, this is like one train of thought. This is like the opening, and then this keeps, and then everything that follows is like assuming you have all the details, more or less. And any extra details are great, but it just keeps the story going. But this is like the passage I think needs a lot of work, because what it's lacking, if you'll bear with me one second, all this talking's making me thirsty. I'll get a drink in a minute. What it's lacking basically is, she's hiding above a grotto or something like that. I think within this information that we get, we need, time of day more or less, or if not that, give me some sense of colour, give me some sense of smell. What does the blood smell like? What does she look like? How big is she? What age is she? Like, if you don't want to give those details, that's fine, but I need some sense of like geography beyond the grotto, because okay, we've got the idea of the grotto, but what else is going on? Apparently there's been a slaughter, but you haven't really described the slaughter in any sufficient detail, and it's in this is the passage where I would extend this to like a page basically of writing for the intro, because this is leanly written, but you've only really got one chance at the beginning of the story to capture the reader's attention, because from here you're changing the vantage point and the point of view of the story. You're going, okay, here's a new character, but it's like, but you've only just now introduced Sia, so okay, you've introduced Sia, so apparently I know enough about Sia to now introduce a second character. It's like, really make sure you introduce Sia properly first before introducing Koto, because putting them both together, it's like, oh, is he the protagonist now? Obviously not. So there's a lot of unnecessary confusion happening there. In my opinion. So yeah, that's my view on that. That's about as much as I care to read. This is cooking some brain cells. I'll do one more, then I'll finish, and I can always do more. And there's always a load more to critique. Might pop on again in a bit, but I'll keep these videos to like an hour or thereabouts. Okay, so let me stop. Let me see. The time is 54, so I did that one quite quickly. What's this one called? The Reluctant King. I spent about 10 minutes on that one, more or less. Okay, number 5. This will be the 5th one I've done. The Permanent Summer. 6 strangers from the space colony fleet crash land on an unknown planet and meet a lonely man looking for a second chance. Okay, let's give this a chance. The Permanent Summer. Part 1. The Permanent Summer. Chapter 1. Smoke and Sand. Can I turn the That's better. Make sure you guys can see it, okay. Chapter 1. Smoke and Sand. Journal entry number 1. January 1st, 5502. It is summertime now. Then again, I guess it always has been. The same seasons, the same temperature, the same weather. It worries me. Should anything change, I may not be able to adapt. I have been here for so long. My birth and my childhood were not here, but this is my permanent home. And though there are several means of getting to this permanent place, I know only one way to truly escape. Cool. Cracked earth and dry sand blanketed the surface, while clear blue skies sat above. Cracked earth and dry sand blanketed the surface, while clear blue skies sat above. For me, I don't know what it is about that, but the imagery doesn't stick in my mind. I can understand, I understand the intent, but it doesn't conjure up imaginatively for me, the way it would in, say, June. A hurling metal vessel plummeted through the atmosphere, engulfed by a flame with a trail of smoke that split the blue in two. Not bad. I think the wording needs work, but it's a good image. The still ship followed suit by ripping at the centre. Fire completely consumed the front half of the hull as it spun out of control, a coin at the flick of a finger. A coin at the flick of a finger. These metaphors or the similes or whatever, that they're a little bit off, but it's alright. I get what they're going for. Emergency parachutes. Emergency parachutes shot out from the other part of the hull while the separated front exploded into the ground in a shockwave of smoke and sand. Alarms and sirens wailed throughout the remaining part of the starship as it touched down into the smouldering cloud of smoke, sand and debris. Inside the starship were 6 transparent caskets, 3 of them on each side, all of them bolted to the steel-tiled floor. Status lights on the caskets flickered on and off until the power finally shut down, resulting in all of them opening amidst the chaos. The first to arise was a woman whose casket read, Koro Olcam, at its foot. She leaned upwards out of her casket and swiped at her hazel eyes. Please don't tell me a fucking character's eyes. I hate it so much. It's not important. At her hazel eyes to remove the gooey, transparent paste that not only covered them but the rest of her russet brown, naked body as well. The russet... See, I'm alright with the colour of the skin, because knowing whether a character's white, black, Asian, whatever, that is important, but the hazel eyes is not an important factor for me. Naked body as well. The goo from her eyes would not come off by itself, instead transferring and clinging onto the goo on her hands. When she opened her eyes, red flashes of light illuminated in unison with the blaring signs. Smoke filled the ship and would have left no room to see, if not for the flashing red lights that gave a brief second of visibility and the sunlight that brightened the fumes. Her eyes darted back and forth as she tried to make out her surroundings. People spilled out of 4 of the 5 cryopods in front of her and at her sides, with the person closest to her holding onto the edge of his casket to keep himself up. All she could see was his silhouette through the red smoke. Whoever was on her left had not woken up, or at the very least had not gotten out. Koro hopped out of her casket, using the frame of it to help her stand. The flashing lights guided her to the person on her right, who she held onto to give his attention. Loud creaks of broken steel from the sunlight's entrance partnered with the screaming sirens in a rambunctious choir of piercing sounds that could only be shouted over. Okay, my initial impression of this is that it's quite well written, but the main flaw I see is that this starship crashes and it reads more like a script than it does a novel. You know, because we're getting the imagery, but we're not with the characters until what was her name? Did we get a name? Yeah, it was Koro Oldcamp. So Koro, she you know, she sort of becomes the character we experience some of this through from that point where she's introduced, but not really. Like, I think what this lacks is having it centered more on the character and her experience. Like, I think it would be way more exciting to be suddenly in the middle of the ship falling from the sky or whatever, crash landing, and what would that be like being in the cryopod and being aware of the ship crashing? I think that'd be really terrifying, and just knowing that you're going to hit the ground hard soon. There's so many like interesting moments that can occur there, but that's all just kind of sidestepped, which doesn't bode well for the story for me. What I do like quite nicely is the journal entry at the beginning. I think that's quite nice because that's our act one of the chapter one. Basically, it's like, okay, here's something, you know, that will give you a hint of mood, theme, and all that, and it's okay. It's not that interesting, honestly. But, you know, it gives me the crucial detail is that the year. Okay, cool. We're that far into the future. Good to know. That's a very handy piece of information for me. Then going here, I'm like, okay, we've got a little bit here. I'm a little bit more centered and interested to read this. This goes on fairly interestingly, but I think ultimately it suffers, like all the other ones, from being too vague, and it just skims over way too much interesting information in favour of just kind of moving the story along, but in a way that doesn't really capture my attention. You know, I want to give like a really good example. Because I want to show when a story does it really well. Let me see. I'm going to get an example from H.P. Lovecraft. What was it called? So that was basically my feedback for that. And that was at 103. What was that one called? The Permanent Summer. The Permanent Summer. At 102 minutes. The Outsider. Is it 134 or 141? Okay. So I'm gonna I just want to make sure I knew the name of the story before I share it. H.P. Lovecraft, The Outsider, read online. Okay, so this in my opinion does well what the other stories weren't doing very well. So I want to give a good example to balance out my criticism, to show that, you know, I can actually be impressed by stuff. The Outsider by H.P. Lovecraft. That night the Baron dreamt of many a woe, and all his warrior guests with shade and form of witch and demon and large coffin worm were long be nightmared. Keats. Cool. Gives us a sense of mood, I guess, but not much else than that. Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon long hours in vast... Thanks, Mez. Yeah, fair enough. Wretched is he who looks back up upon lone hours in vast and dismal chambers with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon awed watches. That's all good, Mez, I appreciate it. Awed watches in twilight groves of grotesque, gigantic and vine-encumbered trees that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot of the gods gave to me, the dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken, and yet I am strangely content and cling desperately to those sere memories when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond to the other. I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages, and having high ceilings where the eye could find only cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridors seemed always hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell everywhere, as of the piled up corpses of dead generations. It was never light, so that I used sometimes to light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief. Nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high above the topmost accessible tower. There was one black tower which reached above the trees into the unknown outer sky, but that was partly ruined and could not be ascended save by a well-nigh impossible climb up the sheer wall, stone by stone. Okay, what this does is incredible, in my opinion, if we compare it to the other stories. Basically, what Lovecraft does here is he tells you the important imagery. Where the other ones were using issues where they said, oh, the ossuary, the tomb, the skull. Like, okay, you're giving me one example of an image, and that's good. Actually, no, it's bad. But when H.P. Lovecraft does it, he actually tells you the details. So he'll say, wretched is he who looks back, vantage point. Interesting, okay? Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. So what H.P. Lovecraft is doing in that first sentence is he's giving us a character, telling a story, vantage point 1. And then the character is saying, unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. So there's the central character of this story that's telling it, gives us an opinion of a second vantage point of someone who is unhappy, which ties into their point, the third point, which is them explaining why they personally are also unhappy. Wretched is he who looks upon lone hours in vast and dismal chambers with brown hangings. So right, the other writers, the amateur writers I was looking at, what they would do is they would say something like, wretched was the lone and dismal chambers, and they would stop there because apparently lone and dismal chambers would be like enough information, but it's not, because even though you can assume a lot, H.P. Lovecraft does the work for you. Mez says, this seems like listening will improve my writing, gonna hang out and listen while I can. Cool guys, sounds good. I'll stick around a bit longer then, and so you guys can see how this works. So when he says dismal chambers, he actually then goes into detail explaining, how's it going, Nova? He explains his point. Brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books. Okay? Imagery, very important. Even though you can it gives you a really great aesthetic sense of mood. You know, it makes me think of Beauty and the Beast, you know, where Belle, she's lost in the castle and she's going around the Beast castle and it's all dark and gloomy. Like, it's really creepy and moody, and I really love that kind of thing. But the thing is like, sometimes it seems a bit too obvious, but just saying the imagery can do so much to get the reader engrossed in your story. Such a lot the gods gave to me, the dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken, and yet I am strangely content and cling desperately to those sere memories when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond to the other. Like, what the fuck he's going on about? I have no idea there, but it sounds cool. And then here we go again. I know not where I was born. See, the problem with the other writers is, say here, there would be like, I drifted into consciousness and woke up in the castle. Like, that's how they would start this kind of story. And it would suck. Because it's just a bad way to start. Stop having your characters waking up at the start of the story. I get it. When you're writing a first draft, you're experiencing the story firsthand along with your character to a certain degree, but that's not good for the reader. You need to get to a point where you know your story and your character and the world so well and confidently, and you know the context of it, where you want to give the impression that your character is living their life and doing things unseen by the reader, and that you can imply and you want to be catching them in the middle of doing interesting things instead of I woke up, I went to sleep, instead of the character constantly reacting to things. I know not where I was born, save the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible. Okay, amateur writers would stop there and carry on to their next point. H.P. Lovecraft then goes, full of dark passages and having high ceilings where the eye could find only cobwebs and shadows. Brilliant imagery. The stones in the crumbling corridors, brilliant imagery, seemed always hideously damp. Brilliant imagery. Evocative. So you're there, but you're not there at the same time. Because the character is describing, you got character's one's vantage point. Then you put yourself in that situation because the character is giving you the room by describing the hideously damp space. And there was an accursed smell everywhere, as of the piled up corpses of dead generations. I mean, that shit is brilliantly written. Brilliant. So, that was just the H.P. Lovecraft explanation of and that was from The Outsider. And I'm gonna look at some more amateur writing to show you like how they could be improved. And I'm gonna upload this video when it's over to my YouTube channel, which is linked below. So you guys can follow the timestamps that I'll put in the description to sort of look through the stories and sort of decide for yourselves how you think, if you agree or not with my views. Okay, let's have a look. As technology continues to improve, not interested. Short story satire. Uven string. Let's try this. Okay. Something I don't even know how to pronounce that. Uven string. Can you guys see this? Okay, I just want to double check. Yeah. From a burning house stumbled the young boy. Coughing up soot and gasping for air, he trudged through the rain, dilated pupils darting about. Around him danced the shifting shadow of fire. His striped pajamas were in tatters. He carried nothing in his arms, save a small stuffed animal which he clutched closer to his soaked chest as he walked through the darkness. What just happened, he thought. Pulled out of his room by his mother, he was told to run as fast as he could, as the light tore into his eyes. Yeah, exactly. He had barreled down the burning hallway. Eyes fixated on the doorway, he heard cracks in the ceiling and an ear-splitting wrench. Then, darkness. Like a switch being flipped, freezing rain was hitting his skin, and midnight's tenebrosity had enveloped his body. Great point, Mez. Then the boy arrived at the street corner. His legs buckled underneath him and he fell to the ground. I really don't like buckled underneath him, personally. I think it's used way too often. The word buckled, it sounds like it could be really evocative, but honestly, it's used so often nowadays, it's a bit generic. Buckled is so over dramatic, in my opinion. Tears welled up in his eyes, sliding down his cheeks as he turned and saw the burning carcass of what was once his home. His parents and his sister were nowhere in sight. Down the street came ambulances and fire trucks, their lights flashing through the nightmare he had woken up to. The sirens were deafening, the smells of smoke and rain were overwhelming, the colours too bright for his raw eyes. The boy closed them and covered his ears in despair, shivering on the sidewalk. Time itself was stretched taut, and around him the noises began to fade. After a moment of stillness, he opened his eyes again and everything seemed bearable. The colours were less saturated, the rain feeling weightless on his skin. Curiously, he lowered his hands and found that a muffled silence had blanketed the entire street. How strange. The firemen seemed to be shouting orders, but their voices came from afar. Nobody had noticed him sitting in the darkness. "Are you okay?" a voice asked him. The boy flinched, then let out a deep breath. It was a man he had never seen before, perhaps from a neighbouring street. He was not alone. Other figures had arrived as quickly as the fire started. They stood on the street, muttering to one another and taking pictures. The boy remained quiet. Let's see. Okay. So, I actually think this is quite well written. This is pretty decent. I think, because obviously we're going to start getting into the dialogue and everything there, right? So that's like the scene proper, and so this is like the build up to that scene. And I guess a lot of details have been omitted because the ongoing mystery of like what caused the fire and everything is there. I think my issue with this, if I really had to nitpick, though I actually think this is pretty decent, is the vantage point again of, so we're with this child, but the child is also the source of mystery. So so who are we positioning with emotionally? Because someone's talking to the boy, right? And I'm pretty sure this is going to lead into the boy being like some unknown. Let's read on. Let's read on. Let's see what happens. Is this your home? The stranger's voice was warm and comforting. The boy turned his head and after a moment of hesitation, nodded. The stranger sat in silence. What is happening? The boy asked, his voice barely a whisper. Those men are trying to make sure nobody is hurt, he paused, observing the firefighters. It's their job to save people caught in a fire. The boy felt a lump in his throat. My family, they might still be inside. Are they going to help them? They are going to try their best, of course. We can only watch and see what happens. That's some bad dialogue in my opinion, but that's fine. You don't talk to a kid like that during a fire. It's crazy. They sat quietly, observing, like it's way too mellow for the situation. They sat quietly, observing the firemen at work. Working with muffled shouts, they forced the flames to retreat deep into the house. With the flames withdrew the neighbours, returning to their homes. With the flames withdrew the neighbours, returning to their homes and beds. I don't really get that line. I need to go back now, the boy declared, rising. The man reached out and rested a hand on his shoulder. Hey, it's not a good idea for you to return quite yet. Why not? I need to find my family, the boy stuttered. Come walk with me. I promise you'll have as much time as you want to visit your house after. The firefighters will need some time to help your family, he replied earnestly. The boy frowned. So maybe this is some kind of like supernatural thing going on where the guy is like, the kid's dead or something. I've kind of lost interest though. Interesting imagery. The fire works quite nicely. I don't really feel like an emotional connection to the boy as a character. He's way too vague and generic. The guy that he's talking to is way too vague and underdescribed. And I don't really have like a point of view with which to like get into the story. So a lot's happening, but again, I think it's like the movie syndrome where people watch movies and then they try and basically create the movie that's in their head onto the page, but they forget that you're writing a book, you're writing a novel, and in these kind of stories, the most important thing you need to do is make sure that the reader, their attention is tethered, so that when you describe something, there has to be a point as to why. It has to pay off. Like, there's no point in telling me, details if the details aren't relevant later on, because you're ultimately wasting my time. And so the problem is that if I don't know if the boy is going to be the main character, which it doesn't, I'm not sure yet, it's too vague. I need a promise of like things not going to be wasting my time. So yeah, I just don't have a character through whose eyes I am discovering and finding things interesting or not, like, and there's not a real solid idea of the theme there either. Nova says, the only good thing that I've ever done when writing was the fact that I let my imagination run wild. Unfortunately, I've been unable to write any story that I would have enjoyed myself. Well, Nova, if you stick around, I might be able to help you with that. Because I give loads of writing advice that's practical. I've got a stream, if you go to my YouTube channel, it's linked below, where I show my own writing process, writing a story from scratch, and so you can see how to do a more functional building block type way of writing. So because the main reason people struggle with writing is not because they lack imagination, it's that writing, the idea of a man that sits at a writer, or woman, of someone who sits at a typewriter or whatever, or their laptop or a pen and paper, that you sit down and the story just spills out magically, is utter bollocks. Only a very minute, set of people can do that. If you're like what I do, and if you look below, you can see all the stories that I've written, and you can sort of enjoy if you want to look them up. What I do in my writing is I have a system in place where I basically tackle the context of the story, because if you don't understand your story, here's the best way to explain it. There's two things that you're trying to do in a story. One is actually write the story with really good prose, and the other one is to make sure the story makes sense. The problem is that people, when they write, they try and do both at the same time, which is what creates frustration, and it's the reason why people only can write like 100, 200 words a day at best, because writing becomes like a serious chore, because you're trying to do something that's basically impossible, because you're saying, okay, let's see what Mez says. Mez says, the reality, you squeeze out the first draft and it's a turd, then you polish that turd until it looks like a diamond. You see, Mez, in my opinion, this format of writing, doing that, doesn't really work in practice. Because if you're writing and trying to figure out your story, and you're putting pen to paper trying to write the story as the reader's going to read it in your first draft, it's not a good idea, because the way you discover who your characters are and how everything makes sense, that is a completely different creative journey to the creative task of actually making the prose read really well and making sure things are delivered in the right order. My recommendation is basically to plot out Act 1 of your story as the context as much as you can, so that you need to basically know where you're going and have a milestone point to reach, so that you have a goal to write towards, and then when you reach that goal, you need to think, okay, now I've reached this goal, I need to go to the drawing board and keep pushing my story forward. But most people never get beyond the first act or beyond the first 30 pages of their story, because they didn't think hard enough about the context of their story and where they're going with it. Because if you just kind of write on a whim and just, let your imagination run wild, you could possibly write one good book if you're lucky, but the next book you write is going to suck, because you haven't really learnt the craft of creating a story and building the context properly and making sure you have a really firm foundation to build from. I think one of the authors that suffered from that really badly was Ernest Cline with Ready Player One, and his sequel book, Ernest Cline, Armada, a novel, right? So basically, Ready Player One was a pretty cool story to read, but basically what he did as a writer is he poured all of his enthusiasm for like the 80s and like video games, virtual reality. He put a self-insert character and he wrote it and he did his best, and it worked quite well. It's a decent read. But his next book, Armada, was basically made with the same exact effort and premise. The story was different, but it was essentially the same thing again. But it suffered from being the same thing again. Because he basically was telling the exact same story, wish fulfillment story all over again, without having a proper sense of craft underlying what he was doing. So that was his problem. Let's keep going with this story. It might be good. First, I think we're talking about different things. First draft is still not going to be a polished work. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, don't get me wrong. Regardless of the process, you're always going to have like first draft, second draft, keep polishing it, 100%. But what I think the issue is for a lot of writers, and I've gone through this a lot myself, is if you keep redrafting too many times, you get burnt out and you lose interest in your story. And what I think a lot of writers need to learn in their craft is how to minimize the amount of redrafting that needs to happen. And that can be done where you could write a decent first draft firstly and then build on a really strong foundation, instead of starting from something really, really just not good. Basically, if you're writing a first draft and you could wholesale cut away like whole paragraphs, that's really going to kill your motivation. Like, imagine running a marathon and then someone was just like, they just pick you up and take you back a mile. Like, you'd just be like, fuck this, I can't run this marathon anymore, what's the point? It's just easy to lose your motivation. So, the stranger's voice was warm and comforting. The boy turned his head. After a moment of hesitation, he nodded. What is happening? The boy asked. I think we read this. I need to go back now, the boy declared, rising. The man reached out and rested a hand on his shoulder. Hey, it's not a good idea for you to return quite yet. Why not? I need to find my family, the boy stuttered. Come walk with me. I promise you will have as much time as you want to visit your house after. The firefighters will need some time to help your family, he replied earnestly. Like, how do you know he replied earnestly? Does the boy know that? Does the reader just assume he's replying earnestly because the omniscient narrator's telling? Who is the narrator? From what vantage point are we being told this story? The vaguity of the vantage point is what is making this story not work for me right now, even though it has a lot that is going for it working quite nicely. The boy frowned. Why should I trust you? I don't even know you. I know your parents very well, the man explained. I was there when they met, actually, along with when they got married. He paused, then recounted their names, along with the boys and his sisters. Okay, why won't you tell us that information? Why are you scooting over that? Is it a mystery? The boy shrugged. Something about the stranger's demeanour made him seem truthful. The two began walking down the street, cloaked in the darkness that surrounded them. Bear in mind, we have no details of what the boy really looks like or what this man looks like. And I'm assuming there's some supernatural entities or something because of the complete lack of detail. The man took a deep breath. In every life there must be an end. It is inevitable, but dwelling on that forthcoming would be a disgrace to life itself. He paused, noticing the confused look on the young boy's face. The man smiled. Let me say that slower. If we lived forever... Yeah, Nova, I feel you. I'm constantly battling with myself to be like, which idea is the one I'm going to spend time on. I usually find that some ideas are just better than others, though. And some ideas you need to be the right age to tackle, you know. Because I'm 26, and so right now, most of my stories that I write in some way, in some shape or form, are just coming of age stories. You know, and it's not something I can really help. It's just, you know, I am coming of age myself in a way, and so naturally the dilemmas my characters are going to have will reflect my own personal experience, because I'm pouring a lot of my own emotions and life and history into my writing, even though it's like fantasy and sci-fi and horror and that kind of stuff. Okay. If we live forever, then every minute or year we spend alive would not mean anything at all. The end of life is what gives life its meaning. Now, we should not focus on the end, not while we have our lives to enjoy, but understanding life is treasured and fragile, helps people live to their fullest. Now, if I'm being honest, what the fuck is going on in this story? So I was interested in the beginning because of the fire and the boy and all that, like, the boy leaves the burning house, and that's pretty interesting. The freezing rain and the fire, like, all really cool. But as soon as this other strange guy turns up and we get no details about him, and now he's pontificating about, like, you know, why we can't live forever, it just seems ridiculous to me, honestly. Like, at no point we have nowhere near enough information about these characters to warrant. This reads almost like an amateur Neil Gaiman novel, and I'm personally not a big fan of Neil Gaiman myself. But at least Neil Gaiman has like a stronger sense of like promise and understanding of like, okay, you don't know enough now, but at some point later in the story, I'm going to reveal to you when the time comes. That was one of the reasons I didn't really like the book American Gods. But I stuck with it for a bit, but I kind of felt the same issue of like the character. I just want to know the interesting details now, so I can make my mind up about the story, instead of like, you know, waiting for it to get good, which it never did. Bear with me 1 sec. I'm gonna get some water and a cup of tea, but just water. Okay, I'm back. Right. Let's get this off. There we go. So, that's generally my opinion on this story. the vantage point just hasn't been decided, and so we can't get into the story. When I showed you the H.P. Lovecraft one, we immediately got some kind of sense of a vantage point from the narrator, who was trapped in this like underground castle. That was really spooky, and it just showed a lot of creative promise. Cool, let's do another one. Also, guys, if you have any creative writing you would like me to take a look at, send it my way. Link it if you want. That's the whole point of why I'm here, is to help people with their writing. So if you feel confident enough to do that, then send it my way. And if you'd prefer I don't read it on stream, then I won't read it on stream. I'll do it personally off stream. Let's have a look. So there's this one. I'm thinking of signing things. Horror, weird fiction. Any old feedback is appreciated. Okay. So I finished this last one about 1:36. Okay, I'm thinking of signing things. Let's see how they do in this one. New book smell and BO. A layer of dandruff on shelves I can trace a finger through, drawing a smiley face next to the cinder block sized infinite jest. The aisle is packed, shoppers jostling me left and right, but the next row I stumble into is dead empty, a store seemingly abandoned for decades, myself the lone ghost still haunting the decrepit establishment. Then a gaggle of kids runs between my legs and breaks the illusion. I need to stop showing up to appointments so early. You'd think an author could keep themselves entertained for an hour in a bookstore, but reading to me is a solitary endeavour. It's hard to get into the zone when half the shoppers treat the place like a frat party. Window shop, anything good looking. I note in my phone's notes in hopes they're available on the piracy sites. Haven't been able to afford new books since before I became an author. It's not like I'm doing this signing because I love my fans. Money is tight this decade, especially for creative types. It also doesn't help that arseholes keep pirating my books. Okay, I can see the ironic contradictions there. My last novel was titled The Brain That Won't Stop Leaking. It's a good title. And yet the vision I found waiting in the manga aisle is more repulsive than any imagery my brain-themed body horror could ever hope to achieve. Two fat weebs locked in a sloppy tongue kiss. The girl wears fake cat ears and a towel, the boy sporting an orange jumpsuit, 3 whiskers drawn across each of his cheeks, fingers thick as... That's Naruto, isn't it? Fingers thick as the tubes from the centre of toilet paper rolls grope through greasy hair. Pinch exposed love handles. Bah! I cry, immediately wishing I hadn't, because now they're aware of me, staring in my direction. Rude much? Says a girl with more facial hair than her boyfriend. That's pretty funny. If I was president, your behaviour would be an arrestable offence, I grumble as I stumble off in the opposite direction. Not sure why I'm so mad, but my face is flushed red, brain boiling over with rage. I know anger management explain what to do when this happens, but I might have been drunk that day because the lesson is hazy. Whatever, I just gotta get out of here before they go Super Saiyan and kill me with their shadow clone jutsu. Alright, that's enough as much as I'm going to read of this one. I like the, it's really ironic that he said, like, infinite jest because of the, like, pointing out. So, like, new book smell and BO. Okay, we're in a modern story. A layer of dandruff on shelf. Don't really like that description. It's a bit gross. I could trace a finger through. Drawing a smiley face next to the cinder block sized infinite jest. it's fine, I guess. The aisle is packed, shoppers jostling me left and right, but the next row I stumble into is dead empty, a store seemingly abandoned for decades. Myself, the lone ghost, still haunting the decrepit establishment. Ugh. Not for me, man. Not for me. It's just too much. Like, it's... There was some funny stuff in it, but I think the reader tries to reference too much. Like, they're trying to imply things at the wrong time. Like, I get the sense that the reader has like a decent... that the author has a decent sense of who their character is. Probably a self-insert. I could be very wrong though. But when they start mentioning stuff like piracy sites, I like it in a way because it is very contemporary, and you get a sense of like, okay, we're in like a very modern, familiar world. And then money is tight this decade, especially for creative types. Like, I get it, but there's ways to show that, you know, in the story. Like, you can have the character be, they take out their wallet, they look at how much money they've got, you know, or they look at their phone and see how much money they've got in their bank account, and then have them slip into the reverie of there's not much money for creative types. The problem is there's no like strong basis for this character's reverie. This reminded me a bit of Confederacy of Dunces, with the main character of that is like this big fat intellectual oaf, and so this reminded me of like a sort of like a Japanese weeb version of that. This whole thing about like the weebs kissing in their cosplay, it's like it's both believable and unbelievable. Like, it's obviously like a satire, as the authors said, but by the time we get to, if I was president, your behaviour would sorry, don't do that. If I was president, your behaviour would be an arrestable offence. I grumble as I stumble off in the opposite direction. By that point, I'm kind of, I don't know. I'm signed out. But I don't know. I think if the author tried to, you know, just keep at their writing, they could get a bit better eventually. I think what we do have here that I like is that we have a vantage point of the character. They're going about the Isles and that's nice. And so the character introduces us. So he goes into an isle, the manga isle, and we see the weebs kissing. And I like that because it gives us a sense of like position. We're sort of like behind the main character as he's experiencing this issue. And so we're situated in the story. The problem is that the characters, sadly, are so like cardboard cutout jokes that there's really, you know, it's just, for me personally, I can't really get absorbed into the story. I think maybe I'm not trying to defend the weebs, but maybe you could have just been less obvious about like taking the piss out of the weebs, I guess. Let's read on. Let's just see where it goes with it. If I was president, the boy shouts back at my back, your book signing would go off without a hitch. Damn it. How'd they know I was the world famous author behind such blockbuster hits as the now... Okay, too dumb. I can't keep going. What could have been like a really cool premise about like an author at a book signing and things get really awkward could have been really fun. But the sheer tone of this, that's just wacky, and it's just absurd in a way where if you want to go into a place where it's all about like the tension of social, you know, say like the guy's nervous at being at a book signing, the more realistic it is, the funnier and more interesting it is when things don't go to plan. But when we're already starting with a character that's kind of absurd, the audience kind of, you know, there's nothing to really surprise us because we don't really give a shit. There's no real stakes to what's going on. So that is my opinion on that. 1 minute 40. That's 1 hour 44. I like the title though. I'm thinking of signing things. It's a pretty good title. Cool. Let's do another one. Wanderers of Weredad. Web serial. On the continent of Weredad, 5 people are hired to deliver a package. It soon becomes clear the quest means so much more. I'm already bored by the synopsis of that. Skate the Thief. YA fantasy. Skate is a thief trained and owned by the local crime syndicate. Boring. I published She Courts Darkness book 2 of my series. That's a sales thing. I drive to remember. Feedback, general impressions. Let's try this. I drive to remember. Monday afternoon. I am in the back seat. I don't care where we are headed. I just look forward to leaving this mad city. Rush hour traffic, stopping at the lights. A baby. A baby is trying to reach me through the open car window, or maybe he is just trying to capture the moment with his little hands. Mummy holds him. He's safe. There is a truck. Looks heavy. I wonder what it's been carrying. Truck driver smoking with one hand on the wheel, eyes stuck at some static place. It's hard to focus sometimes, especially when everything around you has been constantly moving, including yourself. A nice newly polished car. I can see the reddened reflection of our own car, and I can even see the road on the sunglasses of the driver, if I concentrate on it. Everything is clean and new. It is unlike the big dusty car in the front. Looks like a big one. There are children in the back. I can hear them screaming, talking out loudly and just trying to kill time. After school, rehearsal, picnic. In the front seat a woman, possibly their mother, eyes fixed on the radio, trying to forget all the noise in this crowded jungle where even the time loses its root. We are out of the city finally. I can see. Some green fields, sometimes shadowed by fellow cars, fellow lives sharing the same road with us, probably only temporarily. The short white lines of the road now seem like they've formed a one infinitely long line. The sun is preparing to leave this part of the world, so the rays are slowly descending, hurting my eyes a little bit. Stopping at a gas station. Here we see some life again. Cars stopping, outside people smoking, a father trying to get his child away from the gas pump. He probably thinks he has found a huge hose for their garden. Back on the road again. Now a proper sunset there is. I can see the sea appearing and moments later disappearing, like winking to me playfully. The white lines are becoming one again, and we are getting faster. It's almost like chasing the sun. I wonder if we can ever reach it. Looks like we are going to lose to the sun. He is already packed up and ready to fly. I can only give it one last gaze while it is disappearing behind the mountains. See you tomorrow, sun. Now there is the night. I can see the moon rising upon a forest in front of us. It's full moon. It is a nice night to drive. I can still see cars, only fewer, but now the drivers are in disguise. The rays of the moon are just not strong enough to see them through the windows, and the headlights are shadowing their faces as if they were meant to hide the drivers. Everything looks weird in the night. The stars, the sea, the cars, the people, the cities, the houses, the life. It does not matter whether we are driving past sleepy little towns or lively big cities with flashy boards. There is something about the night that follows. My eyes are now closing slowly. I don't care where we are headed. The bliss of night not knowing makes the journey better. It is sure a drive to remember. Alright. That is not a drive to remember. It was fucking boring. Alright? That was boring. Boring. I tell you. But I'll say some nice things. What made me read it from start to finish was it was all in one go, right? Kind of. Monday afternoon, okay? This situates us some way in the story. It gives us some sense of a vantage point, which is okay. It's not a very creative way of doing it, but it's functional. Cool. I am in the back seat. Now we've got a second vantage point. We've got a character in our story. I am. Alright, cool. Not great, but functional. I don't care where we are headed. There's the theme of our story. You know? 1, 2, 3. In 3 lines, we've basically got the whole story summed up there. Basically, I think if this was a haiku or a poem, that's all you need. Everything else is just filler, basically. That's it. That's all the real information we're going to get out of this. And then she's like, I just look forward to leaving this mad city. Completely unnecessary, not needed. Other than the idea that we're leaving the city for nature and, you know, something else, I guess. Yeah, it does that sound. That's what I think as well. Bolso, how you doing? Sounds like something I would write for an assignment in middle school. I agree. But I will say it flows. And whilst nothing of any actual consequence happens, it's alright. It was a nice calm read. I felt it was okay. I think one of the things that I don't like is this one. Mummy holds him. Did not like that line. I don't like the word mummy, I guess. It just came off as a bit like overly feminine all of a sudden. I wasn't really prepared for it. But in general it was nice. But there's really nothing more to say because it was the equivalent of watching someone film a drive. But I tell you, actually, one of the key problems with this is that a lot's happening. But what year is it? You know? I can't really say. We know it's modern with their trucks and stuff. But the problem is it's like, is it the 80s and 90s? You know? Was there any problems on this journey that they went on? The vagaries of it just make it a completely vanilla. Like, I'm sure to the person who wrote it, there's a lot personal in it, but there's nothing in it for someone who doesn't have a personal stake in the story. So it was fine, but ultimately, I don't really, other than practicing writing, I don't really see the point in this. A drive to remember. 152 minutes. We're on number 10. I've reviewed 9 stories so far. Or I think I did 8 actually, because of the H.P. Lovecraft. But I'll say let's say 9 so far. I think they're trying to do a thing where it can be whatever you want it to be, but they are overdoing it and leaving it flavourless. Yeah, I agree. You know, I have a few old stories that I will share if you've got the time, though I kind of regret writing 1 or 2 of them. It would be nice to learn from my own mistakes and move on. My advice is only give me a story that you actually want to improve and genuinely want to keep making an effort with. You know, if you don't believe in the story, don't, you know, like, you've got to be on some level able to defend what you've written. If you're like, it's a bit crap and, you know, I've already kind of given up on it, what do you think? You know, it's not very interesting from my point of view to have a go in it. But I will read anything you guys send me, as long as it's not overly political or sexual in nature. Because I really enjoy reading people's stories and giving feedback. It's like a hobby, basically. Okay. Rest in peace, little monster. For tomorrow, with scores to name. Cool, that sounds good to me, Nova. No pressure, no stress. For tomorrow, dark humour, glow in the dark picture book. I'm good. You do not get 3 wishes. Drama, mystery, self-conflict. I wrote this for a prompt, not interested. I'd like to invite you to read my new novel, From Virtual to Physical and Back Again. It's a noirish tech thriller about creating virtual humans and physical robots by capturing human behaviour and putting them into an AI model. Not interested. Sci-fi sitcom. Ooh, I love sci-fi sitcoms. Untitled Space IT book. Do you like this idea? Also, I would really love you to rate my writing. I've never really shared my writing before. I was inspired by a Reddit comment to come up with a story about an IT man working on a space cruiser in a retro-futurism world. Sounds cool. The snippet I wrote isn't focused on the IT aspect, and instead more focusing on establishing the protagonist and introducing the important character of Captain Aura. Give it a try. Untitled Space IT prompt. And also, guys, if you want to like just get an idea of my own writing, if you go below, there's loads of examples of my writing that you can look at, because obviously I'm critiquing other people's writing, so it's only fair that you guys can have a look and see if I'm full of shit and if I'm halfway decent at it myself. I'm flawed as a writer for sure. It's a lot easier to critique than it is to actually write something good. Trust me. Okay. Untitled Space IT prompt. It was an almost universal trope that IT employees are never fully treated as part of the collective unit of the ships they served on. Partially due to this well-known fact, wherever 2 or more ships would meet up, it was expected for the IT employees to all get together and do whatever it was that IT people do, presumably a lot of IO exchanges. I, however, was not interested in commingling with someone based purely on their career choice. No. I hate that, by the way. This bit, no, like that no, comma, it's not good. Please try not to do that in your writing. It's really annoying because I know it seems like, no, I'm writing something with commas for effect. No, like it doesn't work. No, I had my intentions more in line with my personal interests. Oh, please tell me more. To be honest, I listened to enough critiques that I have been judging your skill and style from your advice. Fair enough. Hope you're satisfied so far. Completely abandoned and ready for the taking, the entire flight deck of the X-12 was lit solely by the dim overhead lights that were always on, even in a power outage. With the crewmates of both ships busy commencing in their IO exchanges, it would help if I knew what an IO exchange was. No one would be the wiser of what I was about to do. Seem to know what you are talking about and be aware when you don't know. Yeah, basically. Completely abandoned and ready for the taking, the entire flight deck of the X-12 was lit solely by the dim overhead lights that were always on. See, I know it's so annoying when you read people's writing because I know what they're trying to do, but it doesn't work. Like, dim overhead lights that were always on. The problem with this is it kind of reads like they're trying to create like a movie scene moment, right? But really, that always on, it's not tangible. Do you know what I mean? Like, the only thing I'm really getting from that is like the author's trying to tell me what's going on in the story without really letting me show it. When I showed the H.P. Lovecraft example, he just gets straight to the point. He's like, ancient library, damp walls. Like, he just tells you it and lets it be. He's not like the walls that were always damp. No, he just says the damp walls. Do you know what I mean? Because then you, as the reader, will then fill in the gap and be like, well, if the walls are damp now in this ancient dark castle, then they're probably damp all the time. And as you're thinking about the that for yourself, you get engrossed into the story. With the crewmates of both ships busy commencing... With the crewmates of both ships... Yeah, basically, Mez. With the crewmates of both ships... Oh, guys, if you're interested in viewing more future streams, please consider leaving me a follow. If not, totally fine. With the crewmates of both ships busy commencing in their IO exchanges, no one would be the wiser of what I was about to do. Sitting down in the captain's seat, I began... Yeah, the thing is, when you say always, Mez, it's like we've just started the story and you're telling me about always. It's like it just doesn't add anything. It's so much. It's filler words basically. It's almost like you're crossing writing genres, because it's like, are you telling me this on a conversational level, or are you trying to tell me more of like an engaging novel type story? You need to pick one. Dipping in and out of that, when you use the word always like that, it's way too formal. Or informal, I should say. Initially afraid of being heard, I quickly grew accustomed to my temporary role. I began to meekly whisper out a few orders to an invisible crew. Initially afraid of being heard, I quickly grew accustomed to my temporary role as leader and began to instruct my phantom subordinates with the powerful and commanding voice of a natural-born leader. So, by the way, they describe this as a sitcom. Nothing funny about this so far. Navigation, how much longer until we approach planet Zenith? About 22 minutes. The formatting needs a lot of work, but it's on Reddit, so I'll let it go. About 22 minutes until we reach the border of the planet's gravitational pull, Commander. I responded to my own question in a tone mocking the presently absent Gerald. Ugh. So, like, Gerald, we've got a named character here, known fuck all about him, and it's like an in-joke where it's like, I don't know your in-joke yet, so don't mention it, please. Pilots, are we prepared to engage the planet? Yes, sir, we've accounted for Zenith's abnormally dense core and have calculated the exact gravitational force we will encounter on our descent. Quinn, another named character. So we've got Gerald and Quinn. Okay, cool. Just when you name a character, imagine like a name is like saying the word fuck. Like, that's what it does to your attention. It just immediately takes you out of the story if you don't know anything about the character. If I knew who Quinn was, I could reference and put it in context to everything else in the story. But by just saying the name Quinn, it's just a dumb word. I've got no emotional attachment to it. Quinn, the current target of my imitations, was spared the mocking that Gerald received. Good. And if all's well, I think I'll sit here with a smug look on my face while I stare at Quinn's breasts, somehow believing that she doesn't see what I'm doing and thinking that I'm a giant creep. As I continued with my rant, I realised that I was, perhaps, not alone as I previously thought. I guess it's going for a comedic tone, but none of it's landing because I'm still confused about what the fuck's going on. Like, if you just told me, like, this guy is on the ship and he intended to do blah blah blah, and then tell me what's going on, maybe I'd find it funny. What the hell are you doing? Startled beyond my wits. I quickly jolted around to see the last person anyone would want to catch them messing around in the captain's seat. Petra Aura, captain of the X-12, looked down upon me with eyes consumed by fire and a smile shared with the devil himself. I'm done. I'm done. That's it. You broke me. Jesus. That's just too much. The devil himself. To be fair, I'm very guilty of using the devil as a comparison to someone. I'm very guilty of that myself. In a story I wrote. Eyes consumed by fire. Nah. That doesn't work. It's way too over dramatic, I feel, for what's there. Yeah, it's too over dramatic. So yeah, I think when you're writing a comedy, the most important thing you need to do for the reader is to make sure that they're not confused. because if they get confused, then you're going to overwhelm them, and they're not going to find, they just can't find anything funny, because unless the joke makes sense, then you're not going to laugh. So that'd be my advice. What I would probably recommend to this author is to focus on macro images. You know, someone sitting in the captain's seat. Really spend a paragraph just describing someone sat in the seat, talking on the intercom. Give me what they look like. I guess the only way you can say is like, do it well. But what this is missing is like, if it's a situational comedy, just create moments where we have the time to really soak up the main character and what they're thinking of doing. Because right now there's so much going on with all this sci-fi stuff, I can't keep track. That's my advice. 205. What's this one called? Space IT prompt. There we go, guys. So that's 10 stories that I've critiqued in this stream. And after this stream, I'm going to contact each person individually and just let them know that I've done so. See what they think. And so yeah, I'm going to go in a minute. But before I go, is there anything anyone wants to ask me? Because I'm happy to answer any questions. You know, not just about writing, or you know, you can ask me about stories and books, films, anything you're working on. Nova says, "Hey Mez, remember the story I wrote called 70 Days? Well, what I'll do, because I think it'd be quite fun, I'd like to ask if you're interested in meeting more writers that use Twitch. There's a community Discord I would like to invite you to." I would love that. I think that'd be really nice. So yeah, if you want to link it or whatever, you can. Let me put it in the chat. That's my email. If you want to send a link to my email, that'd be good. But yeah, that sounds good. What's the story called? I assume I just realised you guys probably know each other because of that. I kind of got back to it, and a sense of pride and somewhat good memories flushed my mind. It's written in a very literary way. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to share... So I'm going to basically go, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick around and I'll play one of my stories, which I've got as an short audio drama. So you guys can have a little critique of my story if you want. This one's I guess you could call it a horror story, but it's a more like weird fiction. Can you see that? Yeah. Let me just turn this music down. Alright. So this is The City Itch.
The City Itch. Moved to the city for a few years,
and make enough money to buy a home in the country and to last them a lifetime, in and out like a bank robbery. Robert taking the architecture firm he worked for all he could, and Shannon doing the same with the prestigious events company she worked for. They knew going in this was a decade-long plan. They were a smart, educated couple that grew up working class. They achieved where their peers floundered, giving them a shot at living better than their parents ever did. Regular vacations pinched at their savings, as did the cost of living in the city so close to their offices. They had idle plans to marry one day. Children weren't a want or a concern. If it happened, it happened. Promotions at work were on the horizon for both of them. And still, neither felt committed to city life. It seemed too good to be true. Real life would come crashing in, wouldn't it? Nights out on the town would become nights in, wouldn't they? Diaper changes, homemade dinners, losing contact with friends. Vacations no more than screensavers on laptops to be idled over every few years. It had been years since they last talked about leaving city life behind. Staying had become a foregone conclusion. Both were masters at avoiding the hard questions in favour of distraction. But then, would they become the Middle Ages like their employers before them? Would they become the broad-faced alcoholics in denial? The ones trying to hold on to their youth by using their work influence as a means to stay close to the new blood in the companies they worked for? The new blood would become their child surrogates, and their friends too. And then one day, the new blood would become the old blood too, the cycle repeating itself over and over. This was the inevitable future. It had to be. They worked far too hard to maintain what they already had to be ignorant of that. It wasn't as if a clean break were possible. There would be leaving parties and a transition of responsibilities and the ever-present feeling of wanting to stay after all. They knew they wouldn't be young forever, yet they simply didn't want to leave. They would have to wait until next year, at least, to even start thinking about leaving seriously. They were going to Dubai for a vacation in 2 months, and Robert's firm had won an exciting bid with a Chinese company with a fetish for outlandish spending. And didn't Shannon owe it to herself to maintain her position in her company? She had worked long and hard to get out of her stuffy little cubicle, and now, wasn't it her right as a kind of feminist to keep it? At the very least, she couldn't give her position up without serious consideration. She was a core influence in team meetings, codes of conduct, workshops and seminars, and, best of all, recruitment. The company had handed her the keys to power without the messy accountability. There was always a job to be done. If there wasn't, she would dream up something new to do, to occupy her time, and consequently monopolise everyone else's time. She honestly couldn't ever see herself giving up this kind of power and control willingly. The greatest threat to all Shannon and Robert worked for came in the form of a viral outbreak in several far-off countries. The virus was coined the Bullire virus by the media. The virus symptoms reminded Shannon of the bubonic plague she had learned about at school. The Bullire virus expressed itself as a large pus-filled boil, which could emerge anywhere on the head, face or body. The boil varied in size from as small as a marble to as big as an apple. Shannon paid little heed to the growing concern over the Bullire virus, even as cases began to crop up in the city. But in 2 months, the virus went from a fringe novelty joked about during team meetings to a very present concern across the world. Shannon held 2 seminars on new work safety standards to keep safe from the virus. Despite these seminars, one member of staff after another, in increasing escalation, was diagnosed as positive with the Bullire virus. These members of staff were immediately sent home with their pay at a reduced, but still very much livable rate. Shannon would have worked from home right away if not for her responsibility as role model for her co-workers and the new blood. However, with just essential staff in the office, Shannon found herself with very little to do besides making plans for when things would return to normal. The back of Shannon's right calf itched something fierce. Sat in her spacious office, Shannon checked her fingernails and saw there was blood beneath the nails on her right hand. Shannon looked at her calf and saw what she was sure hadn't been there not an hour before. A bulbous Bullire boil, the size of a golf ball. A single line of blood leaked from the edge of the boil where Shannon had scratched and dug in deep with her nails. Shannon had been disgusted by the media images of the virus boils, but now that it was on her own skin, she felt a deep revulsion. The boil itself looked tender and fragile, almost translucent, with the pus visible within. Shannon knew pus was nature's band-aid, a means to smother a possible infection in an attempt to keep it from spreading. But that didn't make it any less upsetting to look at. For Shannon, the boil was almost too big and obscene to take seriously. It looked like some special effect from a cheap horror movie. Shannon cleaned up with wet wipes and used a first aid kit bandage to cover the boil. This made the boil itch even worse than before. Shannon's eyes watered from the effort it took to ignore the call to itch as she arranged for a cab to come pick her up outside the office. Once home, Shannon ran a hot bath and sat on the edge of the bath, trying to muster the courage to submerge herself and the boil into it. It was known the boils, though fragile-looking, were actually quite tough and very resistant to heat. Shannon felt immense pain and relief as she eased the boil beneath the hot bath water. She sat in the bath for 2 hours, occasionally adding more hot water and letting some drain to keep it from overflowing in the tub. She stayed until her hands and feet were pruned, and she was sure staying in any longer would do more harm than good. Once she was dried and toweled off, Shannon called Robert. She told him she had the virus. "Just don't scratch it or it will spread," Robert told her, parroting the advice everyone now knew. Shannon asked Robert what he intended to do now she had the virus. "I'll stay in the office for the next few days," Robert said, then added, "There's only a handful of us working on my floor anyway." Over the following 3 days, Shannon's boil continued to itch. Shannon barely slept. She sought distraction in her work, but the itching made long periods of concentration fleeting. Her usual comfort shows ceased to engage her attention. Finally, Shannon turned to what always worked when she needed a distraction. Drink. 1 glass of wine became 2, and within just one evening she finished 1.5 bottles of wine. Later, Shannon woke on the living room couch in her pink pyjamas, with one leg draped over the covers she brought down from the bedroom. The stale smell of alcohol filled the room as Shannon remembered where she was and all she had drank. Then the itching began again. It never stopped, but Shannon was awake now to notice it, and now the itching was twice as intense as before. Shannon eased upright on the couch and felt the back of her neck where it seemed half of the call to itch resided. Shannon's palm cupped what felt to her like a shell-less boiled egg, still warm and slippery. Shannon used her phone to see what she knew was already there, a thick, pus-filled boil. Shannon looked at her right calf. The boil that was there before had popped. Dried pus residue and blood coated the back of her right leg, down to the heel. Beside the gooey crater of the popped boil was a new, golf ball-sized boil. Shannon ran another piping hot bath and sunk herself into it. The pain temporarily kept the itching at bay, so she had some time to think. Shannon wrestled with indecision over whether to call Robert. She decided against it. There wasn't anything he could do. The itching only grew worse, prompting Shannon to open and drink more wine. Days passed with Shannon in a state of drunken delirium. She made sure to drink just often enough to stay drunk to handle the worst of the urge to itch, but also just sober enough not to make the mistake of scratching her boils without meaning to. There were several close calls, but the fear of having even more of these hellishly itchy boils on her skin kept her mind just sharp enough to avoid that danger. On the 7th day, Shannon stirred awake on the bathroom floor, having spent much of the early morning hours vomiting into the toilet. Her throat both burned and felt parched as she reached for her phone. There still hadn't been a single message or voicemail from Robert. Shannon climbed to her feet and slurped some tap water like she did when she was a child. She then wiped her forearm and pressed Robert's name on her phone. The call went straight to voicemail. Shannon sent several messages throughout the afternoon into early evening. There was no response. The boils sang their itching song, and Shannon ignored them, albeit with increasingly maddening difficulty. The creams she had lathered the boils in weren't working at all. Come 7 o'clock, Shannon dressed and took an expensive cab ride to Robert's work building. As far as she could tell, the cab driver was boil-free, and Shannon was thankful her own boils were easy to hide. Shannon stepped out of the cab into the empty city street. The night air was cool and crisp. It made her want to both drink and smoke. There was no security in the lobby. Shannon knew the way up to Robert's floor. Shannon stepped out of the elevator to find the office floor with all its cubicles empty. The lights were dim. Shannon called out for Robert and received no answer. Shannon's shoes thumped on the office carpet as she passed one cubicle after another. She reached Robert's office at the far end of the office floor. From outside looking in, she could see a lamp was lit on Robert's desk, and she could see the glare from Robert's computer screen. Shannon flinched. There was pornography playing silently on the computer. Shannon looked inward. Not again, she thought. Shannon felt stupid for thinking something truly ghastly could have happened to Robert. He was simply back to his old ways again. It hurt to think he would still do this to her, that he could still put his own indulgences ahead of her. But Shannon knew where her line was. Robert had never cheated. She'd forgiven him for his worst indulgences before. It wasn't because she was a forgiving person. She wasn't. She knew she could be downright vindictive, childish, and spiteful, even over trivial things. But she knew what was fair, and she knew that she would be a hypocrite to cry foul play over Robert and his weaknesses, whilst he never questioned how much she smoked and drank. Shannon wondered how she had gotten here, standing outside an empty office. She felt like her past was nothing more than one big joke, and her future was whatever she walked into. In this moment, she saw herself as little more than meat and bone in the shape of a human being. Everything was pointless, wasn't it? Nothing happened for a reason, did it? Yet why did she feel like she was being punished? Why did she feel a kind of comfort in the sadness she felt? Did she feel she deserved this? That this humiliation was inevitable? Was this shame in some way cathartic? When had their relationship become this? When had they stopped trying to better themselves? When had they become the picture-perfect couple of codependency? Shannon spotted a strip of golden light down the otherwise dark corridor to her right. The light was coming from the men's lavatory. Shannon, sensing some trepidation in herself, made an effort to walk briskly toward it. Shannon eased open the lavatory door. She entered and turned a sharp corner. She could now see Robert. There he was on the lavatory floor, curled up and barely moving. He lay surrounded in a pool of yellow liquid laced with red, like custard and strawberry jam. Robert's body, neck and face were coated in popped boil craters weeping pus, and there were at least a dozen new boils that she could see. Robert must have heard her enter. He looked up, clearly in pain. As soon as Shannon and Robert made eye contact, Robert began to weep like a child. Shannon didn't let herself react to this, though she felt like there were fish hooks in the corners of her mouth tugging downward. This wasn't the time for tears. Shannon cleaned Robert and dressed the worst of the boil craters. She found him in just his underwear, so she had to carefully dress him back into his work clothes, which she noticed he had taken the time to dress out of and hang on a coat hanger atop one of the interior toilet stall doors. The news had shown that many men and women found themselves addicted to popping their boils. The pain mixed with the pleasure, mixed with the secreted chemical from the boil, proved to be a vice for those susceptible to it. Shannon wondered what it must feel like to be awake when the boil popped. If Robert was willing, in his addictive impulse, to do this to himself for that pleasure, then it must feel, at least in the moment, worth the pain and regret that was sure to follow. Shannon considered taking Robert to a hospital, but on closer inspection, she could see the boil wounds looked worse than they were. There was a strong risk of infection, but beyond the revolting amount of pus, the blood loss was minimal as to not be a major concern. It took an hour to get Robert out of the lavatory, into and down the elevator and out of the building. A new cab and cab driver was waiting for them. Shannon paid triple the going rate, which was already exorbitant, to bribe the cab driver into taking them home. Once they were in the cab and moving, Robert sat slumped into Shannon with his head on her shoulder. The empty city and its lights passed by their window. It was a long ride home. After much thought and soul-searching, Shannon said softly, "We need to get out, Robert." "Okay," Robert said, his eyes still closed. He was exhausted from what he had done to himself, but he was lucid enough to know exactly what she meant, and he couldn't have agreed more. It seemed fate, or God, or even the Bullire virus itself, had a direct hand in making the clean break for them. The Bullire virus brought industry across the world to a crawl. Shannon and Robert handed in their resignations via email. Besides several furious calls from bosses and co-workers, there was little to be said and done. Robert's boils went away slowly over the following weeks. During this time, both turned to smoking as their vice of choice. Shannon had drunk all of the wine they had in their home, and from that day on neither replenished their stock. Later, they would acknowledge their unspoken agreement to give up alcohol altogether. Perhaps if either of them had acknowledged what they were doing in the moment, they might have talked themselves out of abstinence. One boil reduced in size and was gone once per week until only one boil remained. Shannon with the boil on the back of her neck, Robert with a boil on the inside of his left thigh, which was an unfortunate spot that often chafed. The one boil they each had left would never leave them, no matter how many weeks went by. Shannon and Robert were out in their new backyard. They could see the city from their new home far away in the country. Their days were occupied with making the most of their downsized home. They found the boils that remained didn't itch so bad now they were away from the city. Perhaps the air was cleaner. Over dinner, 6 months since they left the city, Robert idly brought up the question of whether they would ever move back to the city, or even visit for a day or two. They had burned many bridges, but they still had friends there, and there was always something new going on. Shannon even entertained the idea, and more than once they were on the verge of booking a ticket for a train to take them into the city. But they never did go back. The city itch.
And there you have it. That's an example of my writing. Such as it is. I imagine I might have lost a few people, given the graphic nature of the story. Thank you, Mez. I appreciate that. It's really nice of you. Excuse me. So yeah, I'm just gonna give it like a minute or two, and then I'm gonna end the stream, and I'll be back on tomorrow. Probably either to. Not my cup of tea, but I appreciate the quality of the evocative imagery. I appreciate that. Yeah, and I'll be back on tomorrow, approximately the same time, and I'll either be looking into doing more reviews, or I'll keep working on the story I was working on yesterday, which is linked below if you want to check that out. And yeah, and I'll have a look at that Discord link as well. Alright, cool. So, thank you everyone for hanging out. Really appreciate it. And until next time, it'll be good. Cool, guys. See you later. Bye-bye.